key issue is not deliberate or not delivered. Once you've decided to learn a language, you're going to take some deliberate steps to, acquire that language. Hi there, Steve Kaufman here. And today I want to talk about, how deliberate should we be in learning a language? Should we deliberately study the language, or do we just acquire it naturally? Remember, if you enjoy these videos, please subscribe. Click on the bell for notifications. If you are following me on a podcast service, please leave a comment. So this subject comes up. You hear people say, well, we just learn the way kids do. Obviously, children, especially, say, young children that move to a new country, they acquire the language quite naturally. They don't study. They don't deliberately try to learn it. And sort of compelling input, if we're driven by our interest in the subject matter, we're not so conscious, let's say, of sort of a deliberate effort to learn. Certainly in my experience now with Persian, where I had a lot of interesting content, I was mostly pursuing this sort of interesting content about Iran, and I wasn't sort of consciously learning. But is it true that we don't deliberately learn? I think we do. As adults, if we decide to learn a language, we make a decision. We are deliberately deciding to learn. So we're not like the child who's surrounded by friends and will gradually and naturally pick up the language. Also, if we don't do something quite deliberate, just by being in the environment, we aren't going to learn the language. We have Spanish on in the background, Spanish radio while we're working, and we don't understand anything of what we're listening to. We're unlikely to acquire very much of the language, or it would take forever to acquire the language that way. Typically, again, if a person moves to a country where that person would like to learn the language, whether that be France or Japan or places where I have lived, whether it be expat or immigrant or whatever, has to make a deliberate effort to learn the language. The language is not just going to come naturally. So then the question is, how deliberate should our learning activities be? So at one extreme, you could say that if you have this deliberate learning activity, which consists of reading the dictionary, that's probably not going to get you too far. In other words, it's going to take forever to be able to use those words and to acquire vocabulary in that way. If you have a deliberate learning activity, such as, say, doing a lot of grammatical exercises and studying grammar, I think it depends on the person, but in my own view, I think it would take a long time to learn the language, because when we learn the language, we're actually trying to acquire new habits. So there is this aspect of the sort of natural acquisition that in the case of young children who are uninhibited, who are surrounded by their friends, speaking the language, young children, they don't care about making mistakes. They gradually correct their own mistakes. The brain develops these new habits. They don't really need any correction. I think it's kind of amusing when I hear people say that the mother corrects the child in learning their first language. That's simply not true, because again, the children of immigrants, even if the parents can't speak the language, the children acquire it very quickly. So it's not true that the parents, correct their children and therefore the children learn. The children learn naturally. But as adults, it's a little more difficult. We're not as uninhibited as the children. We don't get as much exposure as the children get. So we have to have some degree of deliberate study. But how deliberate should it be? In other words, doing grammar exercises, personally, I find uninteresting. So I don't find any meaning there. I don't find that to be a meaningful activity. I don't find reading the dictionary to be a meaningful activity. However, if I'm starting into a language, using our mini stories at Link, I find that to be meaningful. It's a story, not a tremendously captivating story, but it's a story. So there is some meaning there. I can spend some months on the mini stories because it is meaningful to me in the sense that I have deliberately decided that I want to acquire this language. So through repetitive listening and reading, I acquire enough vocabulary that I can eventually start exploring more meaningful content. And so to me, the key issue is not deliberate or not deliberate. Once you've decided to learn a language, you're going to take some deliberate steps to acquire that language. And the key thing there is meaning. And this gets back to what Dr. Krashen always says: we learn the language from meaningful messages, where we're motivated to understand the message. But there again, if we go back to the example of just listening to Spanish in the background, if you have no way of trying to understand what is being said, then it's going to be very difficult to learn from that experience. That's why when I listen, I like to have access to a transcript, so that I have a chance of finding meaning in what it is I'm listening to. It doesn't have to be 100% meaning, but there has to be some meaning. And so that to that extent, it's deliberate. Now, do we need correction, for example? So there's another deliberate strategy. You get a teacher who corrects you. Personally, I find that that's not necessary. It's certainly possible that when I'm fairly advanced in the language, there are errors that I will continue to make. And if someone were to correct me, I might stop making those errors. Maybe. But presumably, I will develop certain habits that it will be difficult for me to correct. But it won't dramatically inhibit my communication in the language. So on the question of do we need correction, I would basically tend to come down on the side of we don't need correction. If you get corrected, fine, but we don't need it. And corrections can inhibit this other thing that's so important for language acquisition, that is confidence. So if I'm, say I'm visiting a country, I don't know, Czech Republic, and I go in a bookstore and in my best Czech, I ask something, and the sales clerk there begins by correcting my Czech, or, Chinese or whatever it might be. If that happens a couple of times, then I'm going to be less willing to speak in the language. Whereas if the sales clerk, and it needn't be Czech, it can be Portuguese, it could be anything, and the sales clerk immediately understands what I'm saying and answers my question, then I'm encouraged, and so that builds up my confidence and builds up my fluency. So I would tend to say that if correction is a form of deliberate instruction, then I think correction is not a good idea. I think, I've said this before, comprehension questions are not a good idea because it spoils the fun of listening and reading. I was thinking the other day, when I read, Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, there were terms in there I didn't understand. Jacobite or Jacobite, I didn't know what that was. I'm still not entirely clear on the history of that period in Scotland. But it doesn't matter. You can understand 60%, 70% and still enjoy it. So comprehension questions, no, I'm not in favor of. So a lot of the sort of deliberate learning strategy, teaching strategy that is used in schools, I'm not really in favor of. But it's not true to say that we don't have a deliberate strategy. And I think it's up to every person to find the strategy that suits them. And it'll be sort of a mixture of what I would call the sort of big picture learning, which is listening and reading and engaging with the language and eventually watching movies. And you're getting that whole language into you and getting used to the language. And that's the big picture learning. But you probably need to spend a little bit of time on the nuts and bolts. So I have, regularly refer to grammars. It's thin grammars that I found on the internet that I download, and I refer to them when I already have some understanding of how the language works. I might have a quick pass over initially, but then I find myself going back because there are things that I notice in the language that I don't fully understand how they work, and I look them up. So that to some extent, some emphasis or some, looking at deliberate study of the nuts and bolts, is a worthwhile thing to do. So is that 80-20? I don't know, 90-10? It's sort of a part of it is that overall big picture, getting the language in you, getting the brain used to the language. But there is some deliberate, not the least of which is looking up words. When I'm on Link, I look up a word. I don't know what it means. I have to look it up. So there are various deliberate learning activities that we need to indulge in. And of course, the overall decision to learn a language as an adult is a deliberate decision. Which is, as I say, not the case with children who are simply, at the age of 5, they're put into an environment and hardly notice that all of a sudden they're speaking the local language. So yes, deliberate. We make a deliberate decision to learn a language, we make a deliberate decision to stay with it, and hopefully move to where there's more and more meaning, and it seems more and more natural. It seems to require less effort, and we gradually start to acquire the language. So I have dealt with this subject of the details versus the, getting the language in you through input previously, and I found 2 videos that are almost 10 years old. So if you're interested, you can have a look to see whether I contradicted today what I said 10 years ago. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.